I must know more. Let's watch the lore of the Elden Ring bosses.
Where do you go after death? What is the right
To
way
hell.
to die? Can death be overcome? And if it can, what are the consequences of such a thing? These questions are at the very heart of Elden Ring's story, and in order to answer them, I want to go over a set of bosses that are defined by their relationship to death, those being the Deathbirds, the Ancestral Spirits, the Tibia Mariners, the Godskins, the Burial Watchdogs, and the Black Knife Assassins. Understanding these bosses...
There are so many
will teach
different
you so
types
much.
of enemies in this game, it's ridiculous.
In Elden Ring, oneself is separated into two distinct entities. There's the body, which is one's physical self or corporeal flesh, and then there's the spirit, which is essentially the soul that commonly persists after death. In the age of the Erd Tree,
Corporeal.
the
I
bodies
always
of
said
the dead
corporeal.
and their spirits are returned to the Erd Tree. This is done via a process called Erd Tree Burial, where great tree roots in catacomb dungeons absorb the dead so that they might be immortalized.
Right, we learned this
with
in a
the Erd
previous
Tree.
video.
But it was not always this way. In fact, the entire culture of death had a different shape in the earlier days of the Lands Between. Back then, instead of Erd Tree Burial, death commonly burned in Ghost Flame. Ghost Flame, also known as Spirit Flame, is a cold, white flame that is created when bones are burned to ash.
Oh, wow.
We learn this from the fallen hawks who prowl the underground rivers. When the last embers of their torches were used up, they were forced to burn the bones of their fellows instead, and acquired the cold ghost flame.
Wow.
This process appears to help separate the spirit from the body. And while a lot of these spirits appear to be vengeful based on the ghost flame spells, I think in general, having the body separated from the spirit in this way would have been a desired outcome. I speculate that we see proof of this even in the current age, where the wandering dead at Agheel Lake gaze at the sky, praying that the dragon Agheel might burn them to ash. Perhaps
This
this
is
was
deeper.
simply the acceptable
This
way
is deeper than the other
to put a tired body
videos so
to
far.
rest.
Very deep.
The keepers of Ghost Flame were the Deathbirds, who tended to the flame in their graveyards, raking out the ashen remains of the dead from their kilns. So I like to think of the Deathbirds as serving the old process of death, and delivering death by reducing bodies to ash so that spirits might be better able to move on. Now, admittedly, a lot of these spirits are vengeful, and that's how Ghost Flame is sort of weaponized by the Deathbirds and sorcerers.
Okay.
But I do think that
Okay. So it's okay, the spirits themselves are weaponized only because the spirits that they chose to use are like evil, vengeful. They want to hurt whoever. So you find a spirit that is vengeful, you hold it, and then you weaponize it by, throwing it at them or at somebody or whatever. And then the spirit is just doing what the spirit does. It's not that you are attacking, it's that you just harnessed the spirit. Got it.
at its core, Ghost Flame was important just because it separated the body and the spirit. After all, the explosive Ghost Flame sorcery compares this process of death to the Erd Tree's process of death, which was pretty all-encompassing, so I think it's safe to assume that Ghost Flame was just really important to the process of death, and it was more than just, vengeful spirits and a weapon to be used. And next we should talk about the Twin Bird, which was the mother of the Deathbirds. We don't find this creature in-game, but we can find its likeness painted vividly
I was about to say, I don't
upon
remember
a kite
that.
shield that one of the Deathbirds drops. The design might remind you of a phoenix, which is traditionally drawn with bright colors and a crest of feathers and a longish neck. Of course, the phoenix is a creature that rises from the ash when it dies, which is obviously extremely fitting for this story. So the kite shield tells us that the twin bird, or this phoenix creature, is said to be the mother of the Deathbirds. But not only that, it's also called the envoy of an outer god. So we can kind of
here
compare
we
the
go.
twin bird to the two fingers.
This was kind of going on for a long time, talking about the ghost flame and the birds, and I wasn't really sure what we were getting to. But okay, I think I'm kind of seeing it now, where it came from, and then an envoy for the outer gods. So, okay, so if that's the case, then the outer gods knew something of the ghost flame long before the Erd Tree was around. So from a timeline standpoint, maybe that's a little wild. Although I was just reminded as I'm sitting here staring at these birds, or not birds, the two fingers. You know when they go like silent to talk to the greater will. The lady here says, you know, this could be thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. So maybe time is not so. It's a longer amount of time than I realized.
Then, who are also envoys to an outer god. They are envoys to the greater will, and similarly, I assume the twin bird probably communes with some outer god of death. And while we're definitely left wondering what greater purpose this outer god might have, the mere fact that it exists lends a lot of significance to the twin bird and its death birds as well. A variation on the death bird is the death right bird, which is an alternate boss, and it's a far more threatening foe, as it actually seems to use power that it's gained from certain spirits and ghost flame. And if you look really closely at its ethereal wings, you might even spy little spirits lurking within. And when I saw these, I was really excited because I recognized the weapon they're using.
That's what I was about to say.
Explains who they are. They're holding a little death ritual spear, and that item reads, "The priests became the guardians of the birds through the rite of death, which is a part of their contract for a far-off resurrection." So deathbirds have a lot to do with sacrificial rites. You know, they don't just attend to the ghost flame, they also deliver death, and they also perform rites of death. So we can assume that these priests were sacrificed in a rite of death so that they could lend a sort of spiritual strength to the deathbirds.
Am I the only one that is just absolutely astonished at the amount of conversation and lore that we are able to have just based on the deathbirds? There is no way prior to watching this video I could have talked for more than 30 seconds about them, and a lot of it would have been like move sets. It's crazy, like how much is actually here. How far are we into this? You know, it felt like it was longer than 5 minutes, but a full 5 minutes of constant talk where I'm learning something new and something new and something new. Man, I'm telling you, the depth of the lore of this game is wild.
But we're still left wondering about the nature of their contract with the Deathbirds, which promises a far-off resurrection for them. You know, what agreement did these priests come to with the Deathbirds? I wonder what has to happen for their contract to be fulfilled, and how will they even be resurrected? In terms of where the Deathbirds appear, they kind of appear everywhere, and I think that might be a hint that their influence was once present far and wide. And while their importance in the current age is likely quite diminished, they still definitely are relevant in the Lands Between. In fact, many other enemies actually make reference to them, and some even successfully channel their
those are
powers.
feathers from the
Even
Deathbirds?
Ghostflame lights the way in catacomb dungeons to this day. But in general,
Use that
there is
spirit
a
ash
lot
right
of
there for a
power
long
that
time.
can be
Latel,
gained
the
from
Headless.
death in the Lands Between, which brings us to the ancestral spirit. In the flourishing landscapes underneath the Lands Between, you would have found the bodies of 3 large stags enshrined by the ancestral followers. These warriors, hunters, and shamans believe heavily in the principle that life sprouts from birth, but also from death. I think this principle is sort of represented by horns, because in real life, horns continue to grow throughout the lifespans of animals, with their primary function usually being to convey a social hierarchy. And here,
They
the
need to
largest
work on
and
their
most
nose
influential
jobs.
creature is a giant stag. And in the world of
They got
Elden
that
Ring,
Michael
since
Jackson
life
nose job.
continues after death, it makes sense then that this creature's antlers continue to bud and grow even after its death. We learn this from defeating the regal ancestor spirit.
Oh, that's why they're so
looking
big.
at the horn of this fallen king. New growths bud, glowing with light. Thus does new life grow from death, and from death one obtains power. Long-lived beasts like this are worshipped by the ancestral followers, a race of beings who keep their distance from the Erd Tree and are just content to await new buds and new growth. If a being does not show signs of budding horns or new growth, then they are sacrificed with an axe called the Winged Greathorn.
Side note, the feeling I had when I found this area of the game, it's like when you're going down that elevator and it keeps going and going and going, and all of a sudden you see, like, I guess what looks like stars, but it's probably just like shiny rocks in the top of a cave or something. But you go down so far and it's just like, You're playing hours and hours and hours later. Well, if you suck like me, you're still there. You're still playing. You look up and you see where I think it's where Moog is in the distance and all of that. Like the game is special, dude.
Interestingly, the twin blades of this sacrificial axe are called Envoy's wings, which might be a reference to the twin bird we mentioned earlier, which was also a winged envoy. According to the horn charm talismans, the ancestral spirits specifically arise from long-lived beasts, and I think this touches on another commonly repeated theme in Elden Ring, which is that there are benefits to living life to its fullest potential. To quote some more Deathbird items, the most glorious end awaits those who cling tenaciously to life, and it is important to render up a death worth offering. Those who lived a heroic life were even able to go on and see a unique version of grace in the afterlife. We currently think that this grace is red, and that these are the same red rays of grace that you might have noticed when you first explored the Forbidden Lands. So this might be the most intriguing part
I didn't
of
notice
the video. Let me explain. Past the Forbidden Lands, and deep within the consecrated snowfields, is a Tibia Mariner, and this one drops Helfen's Steeple, a great sword that reveals just a mind-blowing amount of lore
Cool-looking
for
sword.
one item. First, it reads, "Greatsword patterned after the black steeple of the Helfen, the lampwood which guides the dead of the spirit world." So the word steeple is commonly used to describe the tall spire found on churches, and indeed the design of Helfen's steeple echoes that of the Morion blade from Dark Souls, which also referenced the spire of a church. However, while I think Helfen is likely to be a sort of church, I don't think it's a building. Instead, this item seems to be describing the shape of a black tree in the spirit world, a so-called lampwood or lamplight tree.
Another tree.
That serves as a guidepost for the heroic dead. The item goes on to say that lamplight is similar to grace in appearance, and it is said that it can only be seen by heroic spirits or those who met their death in battle. So the black tree of Helfen is almost like this dark mirror of the Erd tree, but in the spirit world. It's so interesting that it even gives off its own guidance of grace, and there's a few reasons we speculate that this grace might be red. First, a red gem can be found at the very tip of Helfen's steeple, and a gem on the rolled medallion.
Oh, it's exactly the same.
Plus,
Wow.
there's a red glow visible from the sword's gem, and a red glow from the rolled medallion when you hold it up at the Grand Lift, where it takes you to the Forbidden Lands, where we speculate that you can briefly glimpse this lamplight or red grace filtering between the trees.
Yeah, you really do.
So you might be asking,
I never
why
thought
can
it was
we
like
see the
grace. I just
when
thought it was like
we're not dead. But
I just thought it was like sort of a background, like a foggy area. There's some like light flowing through. I never thought of it as like a grace or anything like that.
technically tarnished are defined as the dead who yet live, so it might make some sense that we can see it. The next question is, where does the lamplight lead? And I think there's two options. One is that the lamplight might lead back to Helfen itself. That is the source of the light after all, and Helfen's steeple can be enwreathed in ghost flames, so maybe the dead are sort of put to rest here. Alternatively though, I guess it's also possible that the lamplight has plans for the heroic dead, just like Grace has plans for the tarnished. It might lead them somewhere else as well. We just don't
Think
know.
it's different if you're
In
a
my
hero or
discussions
not?
with Quelaag, who helped with these theories, she pointed out the similarities that Helfen has with Valhalla of Nordic folklore.
Oh, wow.
If you don't know, Valhalla is a place where brave spirits would be invited to dine with the gods. And it seems that Helfen is inspired by that same sort of folklore, since only heroic spirits can see the light. Not to mention, Hel, with one L, is actually the name of the world of the dead in Nordic folklore. And speaking
Wow.
of folklore, this finally brings
I
us
didn't know
back
that.
to the Tibia
Little,
Mariner,
word
the boss
origin.
that dropped Helfen's steeple in the first place. The Tibia Mariners themselves actually have no written lore to speak of, which is kind of a shame.
Wow.
But what they do have is an incredible visual design, and it kind of carries them from a lore perspective, because this visual design is steeped very heavily in appropriate folklore. So, in Greek mythology,
Yeah, I
there
was
is a
just about
stretch
to
of
say that,
water
yeah.
called the River Styx,
Very cool, yeah.
which marks the boundary between Earth and the underworld. And to help
There's probably a ton of similarities between like actual old folklore and the game. You know, people when they write stuff, they pull from the stuff around them. It's not usually like someone's never thought of before. Yeah, so I forget the name. He's probably about to say it, but the name of the person that takes you across the river Styx, death. But there's a name. Yeah, it's all looks very similar. Yeah.
Souls of the deceased cross this river, you have to find the river boatman and pay him to safely take you across. Just so, I kind of imagine the dead in Elden Ring are being drawn to the Tibia Mariner in a similar fashion. You know, he has a purple lantern and a loud horn, and he might offer a similar sort of guidance to the underworld. There is one spell that references this boss briefly. It's Tibia's Summons, and it says, "For time immemorial, the dead have been those who are lost and require guidance and leadership." Suffice to say, death was a very important facet of life in the Lands Between, even for the gods at one point. Which brings us to the Godskins, an order of apostles that were born to deliver destined deaths to the gods long ago.
Ridiculous
I kind of like to think
clothing.
of them as a counterbalancing force to the influence of gods, wielding sharp tools for boring and slicing through flesh, and incanting spells that mocked the wrath of the gods. It seems these Godskins actually succeeded in hunting many gods, if their name is to be believed. Their robes were made
the
by
skin of
sewing together
gods.
patches of smooth skin, and the nobles' robes include subcutaneous fat, which makes them plump and soft.
Gross.
Known for their 7-faced aprons, these nobles are the most ancient apostles, and they're deeply inhuman. Their weapon is not a slicer, but a stitcher, and they wield it with a skill that is unmatched by any lowborn. These beings were elevated to a social class above the lowborn because they served a queen, a glow-mind
Why is that
queen.
dude's neck so long?
The black flames they wield are actually channeled from that queen's greatsword, and it was this queen who raised them from birth in the first place, cradling her newborn apostles in godskin cloth.
Who is she?
So that they might grow to become the death of the gods. This glow-mind queen was powerful, but what makes her character so important is that she was also an Empyrean, chosen by the Fingers. Now, remember, an
another
Empyrean is a candidate chosen by the Two Fingers to become a god. So, despite being such a dark character, the Glow-Eyed Queen was still a valid choice for godhood. And all of this, of course, was before the Rune of Death had been removed from the Elden Ring, and it was from this Rune of Death that the Black Flame originally got its power. We only know of one other Empyrean alive at this ridge removed from the Elden Ring, and it was from this Rune of Death that the Black Flame originally got its power.
The Black Flame originally got its power from the Rune of Death. From a time, so that existed before the Golden Order? I thought, because the Rune of Death was plucked from the Elden Ring. I guess I don't know when the Elden Ring itself came around.
We only know of one other Empyrean alive at this time, and that would have been Queen Marika. Naturally, at some point, Marika and the Glow-Eyed Queen clashed. Though, according to the Godslayer Greatsword description, we know that the Glow-Eyed Queen was defeated by Malekith, who was the shadow of Queen Marika. He is credited with defeating the Glow-Eyed Queen and the Apostles, and sealing off the Rune of Death, which again was the source of their power. What's not clear to me about all of this, though, is whether Marika and the Glow-Eyed Queen were rival Empyreans competing for godhood,
Best buddies.
or if Marika was already a god and decided to take out the Glow-Eyed Queen because the Glow-Eyed Queen was an Empyrean threat to her age. But at any rate, it seems like Marika and the Glow-Eyed Queen are opposites. You know, the Glow-Eyed Queen ends ages, but Marika wished for an age eternal, so it makes sense that they'd clash, but there's still so much we don't know about them. But after all of this, Marika's Age of the Erd Tree began, and during this age, you were supposed to wait for the roots of the Erd Tree to call to you, so that your spirit could return to the Erd Tree after death.
Oh, right. Because when you die, when destined death was removed, you are called back to the tree to be reborn and kind of go find your body.
Immortalized with it. Specifically, these roots were found in catacomb dungeons, and there's even a statue found across the Lands Between that was designed to help people find these catacomb dungeons. This is the statue of Rosus, the Usher of Death, and he shows the dead the path towards catacomb dungeons. The catacombs themselves were built in the age of the Erd Tree. This is proven by root resin, which states that the roots here were once linked to the Erd Tree, and it was for this reason that catacombs were constructed around these great tree roots. So
I like that he pulls in lore from the Japanese translation to the English translation. Obviously, I was about to say, obviously, the Japanese version would be original, but if the story of this is written by George R. Martin, probably not. It's almost like English to Japanese to English, maybe, or maybe English is the original and the Japanese one is the weird translation. Not really sure, but in the end, I think it's really interesting that he uses both of those to get more insight to the lore.
At this point in history, Queen Marika had implemented her new concept for death in the Lands Between, and in her eyes, a proper death meant returning to the Erd Tree. Thus, in the days where catacomb roots were connected to the Erd Tree, these catacombs were valid sites of Erd Tree burial, and I think we literally see this taking place, as corpses can be seen being absorbed by the roots at the end of every catacomb dungeon. The process of Erd Tree burial, though, is described as an honor reserved for heroes, and this process of Erd Tree burial is presided over by Erd Tree burial watchdogs, who protect the catacombs with their impish servants. These creatures are golems, and I think that they might have been created specifically during the period of history where Liurnia had an allegiance with Leyndell, since they serve the process of Erd Tree burial, but their weapons actually have glintstone embedded in them. Furthermore, when hit by impure crystal darts, they malfunction, which I think is further proof of their glintstone origins. In some catacombs and graveyards, the physical bodies of the dead have begun to rise. Now, these beings are defined as those who live in death, and they are a relatively recent phenomenon in the Lands Between. Instead of having their body and spirit return to the Erd Tree, they rise, in an act that is completely at odds with Marika's concept of death, Erd Tree burial, and the Golden Order. I'll go into more detail on this later when we talk about Godwyn, but basically, this all began when Rani stole a fragment of the Rune of Death from Malekith, and then she imparted its power
always
onto
causing
the knives
trouble
of the Black Knife Assassins. You can tell the assassins have quite a lot of secrets in their lore. We do know a few things, though. We know that they're...
You know, even when you're up north in the snowfields and all those dudes are invisible and they're kicking your ass, even with the torch where I could see them, I still died over and over. That's like, I had so much trouble with those dudes.
They're all women, they're all Newman, and they have links to Queen Marika and the Eternal City as well. We'll have to go into more detail on them later, though. But with their knives imbued with the Rune of Death, they carved a curse mark into two demigods, Rani and Godwyn. The curse mark itself is an obtainable item, and it reads, "This curse mark was carved at the moment of death of the first demigod, and should have taken the shape of a circle. However, two demigods perished at the same time, breaking the curse mark into two half-wheels. Rani was the first of the demigods whose flesh perished, while the Prince of Death perished in soul alone." So interestingly, these assassins and the knives imbued with the Rune of Death had the power to cleave life from the physical body and from the spirit as well. Specifically, Rani was the one whose flesh perished, and she became a disembodied spirit, free from her corporeal flesh, which is what she wanted. And
yeah, she's not a puppet, but she is a spirit who uses the puppet as a body.
She now occupies a doll. But Godwyn became the Prince of Death, living without a soul and spreading the Rune of Death across the Lands Between through Deathroot. Now, according to item descriptions, Deathroot is the Rune of Death itself, and it acts as a source that gives rise to those who live in death. Now, what I find really interesting is the fact that this Rune of Death that is embodied by Deathroot and those who live in death, it clearly has aspects of both death and...
Doesn't that look just like the cocoon that Magella is in with his hand hanging out?
And those who live in death, it clearly has aspects of both death and life as well, which makes sense based on what you should have learned from this episode, right? Because death isn't just the end, it's life as well. So it makes sense that those who live in death would have aspects of death and life, all contained in these beings that were brought to life, in a sense, by the Rune of Death. And while those who live in death are a bit unnatural because they do come from this fragmented rune of death, this half of a curse mark, they still have life in death, and so you can argue that they still have a right to life. And in fact, that's entirely what one of the endings is about, at least how I understand it, and I'll try to explore it more thoroughly later on. These beings are persecuted and hunted down by fundamentalists of the Golden Order, and whether these fundamentalists are
How do their heads fit in those helmets? It seems impossible. Don't you feel like their eyes would be like here? And how would it be up here?
truly serving the fundamentals of order in the first place is just a topic that is very interesting to explore. So, in conclusion, maybe it shouldn't be a sin to live in death. After all, to quote Fia, in death there is only peace, for in death there can be no sensation. Thank you.
In death there's only peace, for in death there can be no sensation. That's pretty deep. It's pretty good. That's deep. Well, another interesting one. That one was pretty cool, quite a bit shorter than the others. I didn't expect there to be much lore at all specific to death. Like I said, kind of early in the beginning, like there's dead people, obviously, and the death rate birds and stuff like that. I had no idea there was so much story behind all of that. So that's really interesting. Excited to get to the next one, though. There's so much more, and I must know more. See you then. Bye.